Dude, I'm high-ranking, okay? Respect me. Who the hell is this guy? Who the hell is... Hey buddy, come over here, come over here.
Alright, listen up. We need some bodies for the war. A strapping young man. Let's knock on that door. Excuse me, madam, I don't want to be a bother, but can you give me your son so I can make him cannon fodder? You need our protection. War gives me an erection. You have nowhere else to go, so call me Daddy NATO. Yes, we might have made some mistakes in Libya, but that was nothing compared to what we did to Syria. A 20-year war fought in Afghanistan, but meanwhile back home, I campaign for a gun ban. You need our protection. War gives me an erection. You have nowhere else to go, so call me Daddy NATO. It's too late, dictator. I've already signed your fate. With terrorists, I'm afraid we don't negotiate. You can't be left alone. That's nothing but a dream. You either adopt our democracy or I'll crush your regime. You need our protection. War gives me an erection. You have nowhere else to go, so call me Daddy NATO. We have military hardware that your forces lack. It doesn't matter if I miss my shot, as the media has my back. I know all about you. I spied on you through Prism. Now let me tell you about my religion. It's called neoliberalism. You need our protection. War gives me an erection. You have nowhere else to go, so call me Daddy NATO. You need our protection. War gives me an erection. You have nowhere else to go, so call me Daddy NATO. This is Grand Marshal, Super Lieutenant, Super Sergeant, Lieutenant Commander, Brigadier General, Sergeant Major Alexander Hexagon. And today, we're going to talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy is the art of dealing with nation-states other than your own, whether on a positive basis or a negative one. If you grew up in the 2000s and 2010s, events such as the War on Terror and the Arab Spring would have been a constant during your most formative years. But what's always annoyed me is how little people seem to know about these events. Most folks in the Western world don't have a clue about anything to do with what happened in the Middle East, and I imagine that's intentional. As if people truly grasp just how much of a disaster Western foreign policy has actually been as of late, it would also no doubt wake them up to a much wider problem with our governments. Which is exactly what I want to do today. In Islam, there is a concept known as the Ummah, which is the Arabic word for community. All Muslims, no matter where in the world they are, by mere virtue of being a Muslim, are said to be a part of this Ummah that transcends race, nationality, and gender. All of the Ummah is meant to be united under one state, known as the Caliphate, which is an Islamic theocratic state ruled by an Islamic leader, known as the Caliph. Ever since Islam's inception, there has been 4 major caliphates, each one building from the last. The Rashidun Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Ottoman Caliphate. These caliphates, though vastly differing in its leaders, borders, and capabilities, served as an unquestioned state for Muslims. Yet, with the defeat of the Ottomans in World War I for the last century, the Islamic world has not had a caliphate, nor any proper attempt to create one since, but instead lies a vast array of disunited and often highly corrupt nation-states, dividing the Muslim Ummah up into differing warring factions. It's estimated that around 22% of the world is Muslim, at around 2 billion people, and rising. Muslims are the majority in a whopping 49 countries, and if you were to add up the gross domestic product of all member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, it would equal 22% of world GDP. or over 20 trillion US dollars. With stats like that, it shouldn't be surprising to hear that a united Muslim caliphate would be a world superpower that would, in many ways, even rival that of the United States and China. Hence why the fall and subsequent failure to create a unified caliphate since is almost universally recognised by Muslims as a significant tragedy. The geopolitical power of the Islamic world over the last century has all but diminished, leaving it weak and vulnerable to outside interference. And, whether rightly or wrongly, the Western world is often accused of actively taking advantage of such a downfall. The three main accusations the Islamic world has against the Western world are that the West, 1. Prevents them from manifesting their own destiny, 2. Topples its regimes via deception, and 3. Fuels further Islamic radicalization.
But are they right, or are they wrong?
Well, we're going to talk about three mystery men, all of which there's no doubt you've heard of at some point in your life, yet perhaps not the underlying tale behind them, of which are often cited to prove such accusations. Starting with mystery man number 1, Gaddafi. Libya is a country in North Africa that from 1969 to 2011 was ruled by Colonel Gaddafi. From the moment Gaddafi took power, he made huge social and economic reforms that he believed would help his nation. And, in many ways, he succeeded. When he took power in 1969, Libya's GDP was just $3.8 billion. 10 years later in 1979, and it was $24.5 billion. For context, that means that the average Libyan in 1979 was even wealthier than the average Italian who had colonized them just a few decades before. From 1968 to 1978, Libya had a 50% increase in hospitals, as well as an over 300% increase in doctors, with malaria being completely eradicated across the country. Compulsory early education was increased from 6 to 9 years, alongside free university for all. Huge efforts were also made to increase literacy for adults who couldn't read or write, alongside a huge doubling in wages, rent controls, and a crackdown on child marriage.
A very impressive record. Unfortunately, however, the colonel would prove to be a little bit too adventurous.
It was well known that Gaddafi had dreams of creating a greater union of Arab and African nations that would be independent from Western powers, particularly in regards to matters of finance. Thus, rather than have their currency associated with the US dollar, he instead proposed that a new currency, the gold dinar, should be used instead.
And this would be his downfall.
Despite Gaddafi having ruled Libya for almost half a century, all of a sudden the Western world started to talk about Libya's rising human rights crisis, crackdowns on personal protests, use of torture, etc., etc. And thus, in 2011, NATO, primarily led by France, the USA and UK, launched an offensive in Libya to free the people and bring freedom and democracy to the nation, in an event today referred to as the First Libyan Civil War, a war that would result in the deaths of thousands of people. During this war, Gaddafi stated that the revolt against his rule was a result of a colonialist plot by foreign states, particularly France, the US and the UK, in order to control oil and financially enslave the Libyan people. Gaddafi would later be killed, with his reign ending in a most humiliating fashion, having his corpse vandalised in public with a bayonet knife stuck in his backside.
So, who was right?
Why was Colonel Gaddafi actually killed? Was he killed because we wanted to bring freedom and democracy to Libya? Or, as he said, because of the gold dinar plan?
Well, let's ask WikiLeaks.
A few years after the war, leaked confidential emails from Hillary Clinton, who was the US Secretary of State in the Obama cabinet at the time, came out, and what was in them was truly shocking. In an email sent in 2011, entitled France's Client and Gold, it mentions how they were aware that Gaddafi's government held a staggering 143 tons of gold, as well as a similar amount in silver, and that such was intended to establish a pan-African currency based on the Libyan gold dinar to provide an alternative to Western currencies. All of this was supposedly found out by French intelligence, and in addition, French President Sarkozy's decision to commit France to attack Libya was apparently driven by A. A desire to gain a greater share of Libya's oil production, B. Increase French influence in North Africa, C. Improve his internal political situation in France, D. Provide the French military with an opportunity to reassert their position in the world, and E. Address the concerns of his advisors over Gaddafi's long-term plans to supplant France as the dominant power in Africa.
Where's bringing freedom and democracy?
Absolutely nothing here mentions anything about human rights, corruption, or torture, but it does mention oil, influence, and gold.
And this, dear viewer, is where I'd like to introduce you to a concept known as a big sell.
A big sell is essentially a nice, pretty, and poetic reason to justify an action that is technically true, but also not the real reason. So, for example, your wife has gained a ton of weight lately, and she's starting to look like Jabba the Hutt. But you can't just go up to her and say, "Hey dear, you're getting fat as hell, get on the treadmill." You need to justify said request in a more sugar-coated fashion. So instead, you say, "Hey dear, as we're both starting to get older, we should focus a lot more on our health. I don't want us to die young, so we should consider getting more active so that we can be together for as long as possible, because I love you." The aim was that you wanted her to lose weight, and the reason is so that she looks good again. But she doesn't need to hear about that. All she needs to hear is the big sell. It's to better our health.
Whenever a politician says they're invading a country to bring freedom and democracy, just remember, big sell.
As there's always an ulterior motive behind it that's much more sinister than how it's presented. If you go and ask Libyans today whether they're glad now that Gaddafi's gone, you may just be surprised by some of their answers. As Libya, after his death, was left in complete disarray and was plunged into yet another civil war, quickly going from being one of the stablest countries in Africa to one of the most chaotic, a situation that they have still yet to recover from.
Or, as the French military would say, mission accomplished.
To add salt in the wound, back in 2011 when this war was happening, NATO uploaded to their official YouTube channel what can only be described as some sort of Windows Movie Maker montage of how much they kicked Gaddafi's ass. Something that today, needless to say, has aged like milk.
The UN Security Council passed a strong resolution that demands an end to the violence against citizens.
The international community had to act. The violence unleashed against the people of Libya was intolerable.
Make no mistake, Gaddafi, like most dictators, was certainly corrupt in many ways.
But my point here isn't to paint a positive or negative picture of Gaddafi, but to showcase that it's clear in retrospect that Western involvement in Libya was entirely self-serving. Which brings us on to mystery man number 2, Saddam Hussein. Iraq is a country in the Middle East that from 1979 to 2003 was led by Saddam Hussein.
There was a rumour that Saddam and his regime had been manufacturing weapons of mass destruction.
Which, needless to say, having a dictator in charge of nuclear weapons would be a very dangerous prospect, not just for the West, but for the whole world. Thus, in order to bring freedom and democracy to the people of Iraq, and of course put an end to this ghastly nuclear weapons program, we decided to invade Iraq to save the world. Saddam Hussein was subsequently caught, charged, and executed, with his reign coming to an end as perhaps best symbolised by the famous toppling of his statue.
But there was just one problem.
As everyone and their mother has probably heard, there was no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq whatsoever.
What? Surely not another big sell.
Gordon Brown, who was the British Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, actually did an interview on British morning television, whereby he claimed that he, and the UK government at large, was intentionally misled into supporting the invasion of Iraq by the American Pentagon.
I became Prime Minister in 2007. We were out of Iraq by April 2009, and I told George Bush we were not going to put more troops in, we were coming out. I thought we'd become the occupiers and not the liberators, and we were out 3 years before the Americans. But I've had to look at that decision again.
Because you voted for the Iraq
Yes,
war,
of course.
Right? I mean, and in the book you make it clear that you
I
thought
think we made a mistake.
Will you make it clear you don't think you got enough information?
No,
the Americans
I didn't.
withheld information.
I think the Americans knew that he didn't have these weapons. Certainly in the Pentagon they knew, and they didn't tell us. And, you know, Chilcot did a great inquiry, but he wasn't able to look at the American evidence because the Americans didn't really cooperate with his inquiry. And now when I look at the American evidence, they didn't worry that he didn't have weapons. They were going to go for him anyway.
They were into regime change.
They wanted the regime to change and Saddam out. We had to have a justification if we were ever going to take action, and they had information that I believe they didn't communicate.
Do you feel conned?
I feel misled. I think that's the best word. We were not just misinformed, we were misled by the Pentagon. And I feel the basis of our decision. You see, I talked to the MI6 at the time, and I'm be honest about it. They had said, look, they almost knew the address and the place and the street where these weapons were. And when you get that level of intelligence, which you didn't have at the time, but we were getting that, you have to believe what they say.
That's right. We went to war for over a decade, where over 100,000 Iraqi civilians died over a deception.
But the invasion of Iraq was surely still worth it, as after all, thanks to us, Iraq would go on to become one of the most free and democratic countries on the entire planet. Right? Wrong.
After the war, Iraq was quickly dumped and fell into a state of complete disarray.
Unemployment rose to a staggering 15%, the health and education services all became subpar, and extremism, first with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, seeped into the mainstream, with many Iraqis suffering as a result. Saddam Hussein was overthrown not because of any nuclear threat, but simply because the US government viewed him and his regime as a pain, and thus knowingly orchestrated his toppling via deception. And just like Libya, if you ask the average Iraqi whether the country was better under Saddam or now, as much as they may not like the man, you may be quite surprised by their answers. Because as it turns out, invading a country, screwing it up, then instantly leaving, tends to create a massive power vacuum that often gets filled by people even worse than the guy who ran the place before.
Gee, who could have seen that coming? Except everyone.
Even before the war had even started, the Iraq War was one of the most protested events in human history, with some of the protests even attracting millions of people. Yet such protests would of course fall on deaf ears, and the destruction that would spawn from such ignorance is still echoed to this day.
Thank you for your service.
Which brings us on lastly to mystery man number 3, Bin Laden. When people think of Osama bin Laden, they tend to get the image of a destitute man living in very poor conditions.
But contrary to popular belief, bin Laden was not a poor man.
In fact, he was born into one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. The bin Laden family was renowned for their vast building empire, estimated to be worth over $5 billion.
And because of this, needless to say, bin Laden had a very privileged upbringing.
Attending some of the finest exclusive schools available, and even coming over here to Oxford in England to study English for a while during his youth. But despite his vast wealth and exposure to the West, bin Laden was ultimately a very religious man, and like many Muslims, viewed the fall of the Islamic geopolitical power as a tragic humiliation, and thus was heavily invested in reversing such a situation. And it wouldn't be too long before he had an opportunity to do so. In 1979, the Soviet-Afghan War began, whereby the Soviet Union sent its own troops to invade Afghanistan. Bin Laden left college and travelled to Pakistan, whereby he would use some of his money to help fund the Mujahideen resistance against the invasion. The United States, who of course took a particular interest in making sure their arch-rivals, the Soviets, lost the war, underwent numerous covert operations to assist the Mujahideen resistance, such as Operation Cyclone, whereby millions of dollars were spent delivering arms to the resistance. The American CIA worked heavily with the Pakistani ISI to help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And bin Laden, having also been close to the ISI, no doubt also benefited from such Operation Cyclone investments, though not directly. Bin Laden would later go on to establish a base in Afghanistan himself to fight the Soviets directly, such as in the Battle of Jaji, of which him and his men would emerge victorious. When the Soviets were eventually defeated in the war by the Mujahideen, bin Laden would be seen by many as a hero in the Arab world, who helped liberating Afghanistan from one of the world's mightiest superpowers. He even featured in certain Western media as a freedom fighter against Soviet oppression, if you can believe it. After the war, bin Laden would then return back home to Saudi Arabia, though not for long.
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now, everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
In 1990, Iraq, under the orders of Saddam Hussein, invaded neighbouring Kuwait. This invasion was seen as a significant threat by the Saudi royal family, and thus the Saudis accepted US Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney's request to station American troops in Saudi Arabia for defense purposes. This incredibly angered bin Laden, who argued that non-Muslims, especially soldiers, should not be allowed anywhere near the Islamic Holy Land, especially so close to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam. American President George H.W. Bush had assured Saudi King Fahd in 1990 that all American forces in Saudi Arabia would be withdrawn once the Iraqi situation had been dealt with. Yet in 1996, after such had passed, the American forces were nevertheless still present. This created the perception to bin Laden that the United States had turned his home of Saudi Arabia into a willing American colony, which was not just an affront to his homeland, but also Islam as a faith. It was from this and other interventions in the Muslim world that bin Laden started to view the United States and the wider Western world at large as an existential enemy, which, as we all know, inevitably led to 9/11. In 2002, shortly after 9/11, bin Laden wrote in a publication titled Letter to America that Al-Qaeda's motives for the attack was due to, quote, Western support for attacking Muslims in Somalia, supporting Russian atrocities against Muslims in Chechnya, supporting the Indian oppression against Muslims in Kashmir, condoning massacres in Lebanon, putting American troops close to the Holy Land of Mecca, and much more. In his mind, bin Laden orchestrated the 9/11 attacks because he believed that Western powers were taking advantage of the lack of a unified Islamic power to oppress and disrespect Muslims around the world in numerous ways. Naturally, however, such an attack would of course lead to the United States and its allies to retaliate with even more interventions.
Which is something that, contrary to popular belief, Al-Qaeda not just expected, but actually wanted.
In 2005, an extract was found from an Al-Qaeda document titled Strategy to the Year 2020, which contained 5 stages. 1. Provoke the United States and the West into invading a Muslim country by staging a massive attack on US soil that results in civilian casualties. 2. Incite local resistance to occupying forces. 3. Expand the conflict to neighbouring countries and engage the US and its allies in a long war of attrition. 4. Convert Al-Qaeda into an ideology that can be loosely franchised in other countries without requiring direct control, and via these franchises attack the US and other allied countries until they withdraw from the conflict. And 5. Collapse the US economy under a strain of multiple engagements in numerous places, making the worldwide economic system which is dependent on the US also collapse, leading to global political instability, which in turn will lead to a global caliphate that will be installed across the whole world.
And looking at these 5 stages, no one can deny that, unfortunately, in many ways, they succeeded.
9/11 baited America and its allies into invading Afghanistan, which incited local resistance against us, leading us into a 20-year-long war, which we lost. And as soon as we leave, the guys who we've been fighting take it all back over in less than 24 hours, with much of the weapons we used to fight them left behind. With the only noticeable effect being a huge rise in Islamic fundamentalist groups across the entirety of the Middle East, who now have a big chip on their shoulder against us, while we now have a big hole in our pockets that the next generation will inherit.
Bin Laden would of course be tracked down and subsequently killed, but the damage at this point was already done.
There is no doubt that Bin Laden was a monster who indiscriminately killed civilians, many of which were children, in his crusade against the West. Again, it should also be noted that men like Bin Laden are not born, but made. And due to our constant opportunistic interferences in the Middle East, such as what happened subsequently in Iraq and Libya, that we've no doubt made many more such men that will only go on to terrorise us further.
Such as like in, I don't know.
2005, the 7/7 suicide bombings in London that killed 52 people and injured over 700 more. 2013, the public decapitation of the British soldier Lee Rigby. 2017, right on my doorstep, the Manchester Arena bombing, with 23 people killed by a suicide bomber, most of which being young girls.
And that's just here in the UK, not even counting those that also took place in France, Germany, Sweden, etc.
Such is the never-ending cycle. We intervene in others' affairs, and they respond back via resentment, which leads us to intervene further, which only fuels even more resentment. Repeat ad infinitum. And I've told you the story of these three men backwards chronologically, in the hopes that you can now see how such a cycle perpetuates. And what I've shown you today is honestly just scratching the surface.
Because our interventions in the Middle East, toppling regimes and meddling in their affairs, can only be described as an absolute catastrophe. Kind of like how this hat looks on me. Much better.
We like to view the conflict between the Western world and the Islamic world as a simple battle of good versus evil. We are the pure, perfect angels, and they are the bad, evil demons. But the reality is that the world isn't some sort of stupid Marvel movie, and these conflicts are much more complex and nuanced than our governments and media like to present them as being. The truth is that we treat the Middle East like it's our chessboard, and then we get surprised when its people no longer want to be our pawns. And when one tries to talk against these interventions, accusations get thrown around of being unpatriotic or being a terrorist sympathiser, as if not wanting your military to blow up children in the Middle East somehow makes you the bad guy.
But if stating the truth makes me evil, then feel free to call me Satan.
The facts are that we have allowed, over the course of many decades, before I was even born in fact, a political elite of pure, absolute psychopathy to rule us. And the consequences, not just for ourselves, but for the world at large, have been disastrous.
Who is it that decided that we in the West are the world police, who have the authority to go all around the world and tell everyone else how to conduct their business?
I believe that because the Western world has dominated the planet now for so many centuries, that many of our people have become arrogant, and genuinely believe that we always know better than everyone else. Which thus gives us the illusion of authority to impose our way of life onto everyone else, even if they don't want it.
Look at this poor woman all covered up.
Talk about a society that doesn't respect women. Where I come from, women sell photos of their rectums on OnlyFans to pay for their crippling drug addictions.
Because nothing screams liberation like being turned into an object.
Here's a fact that no one wants to hear. In recent decades, we in the West, thanks to our embrace of neoliberalism, that being social progressivism and economic conservatism, have devolved into embracing an individualistic culture of absolute, unavowed decadence. Our men are furious, our women are depressed, and our children are neglected. And the idea that we should be the moral arbiters of the world, considering the absolute decrepit state of our nations today, is a statement so unbelievable that I think only we could believe it. And isn't it comedic how our neoliberal elite, who constantly sing the praises of multiculturalism at home, are the first to advocate sending in the tanks abroad as soon as they don't want to live exactly how we tell them, trying their best to turn everywhere into a mindless consumerist hellscape. You will eat the McDonald's and you will like it.
But of course, as we've already established, for our elite, it's not really about freedom and democracy at all.
One of the closest allies of the United States is Saudi Arabia. You know, the absolute monarchy that is known for having frequent purges, public executions, bombing its neighbour, and preventing women from driving for decades?
Surely, if this really was a battle of ideas, they would be the first country to be toppled. So why haven't they?
Well, it just so happens that Saudi Arabia is one of the world's largest producers of oil, and is willing to work with the West on selling it on the cheap.
Funny how freedom and democracy quickly goes out the window when there's room to make a quick buck.
As to some of our elite, war is not just a power grab, but also a very profitable business. In 1961, in his last address to the nation, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned against precisely this phenomenon, in what he referred to as the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Neoliberals like war for very simple reasons, because by toppling regimes they have an opportunity to expand corporate influence overseas, penetrating into new markets that can be economically exploited, which is then supported by the military-industrial complex, whose entire business model revolves around profiteering from weapons manufacturing, which is then, by the bought and paid for media, sold to the public as a liberation of oppressed people into freedom and democracy, aka a big sell.
Most modern wars are, to put it bluntly, a business.
One can't help but feel sorry for the brave soldiers who fought in these wars, brainwashed into believing that they're being some sort of hero for their country, only to either end up dead or survive to have massive PTSD and a plethora of other mental illnesses, probably while being homeless in a tent city. Any government agents who voted for these wars, knowing what they did, should be sent straight to prison for war crimes against humanity for the rest of their lives. Likewise for any media whelp or corporate lobbyist who knowingly went along with it. Because there has to be some justice for not just the victims of such wars, but also the Western poor who funded them, and thus have had their needs neglected beyond comprehension.
Which finally brings us on to the lesson I spoke of earlier.
Fast forward to today, and these wars may all be over. But our leaders' obsessions with meddling in world affairs and putting such global objectives above the welfare of their own citizens, sadly, has not. Did you know that in just 2022 alone, my country, the UK, has spent $4 billion on providing other nations with military weapons? That's $59 for every man, woman and child in the country. UK defence spending to double to $100 billion by 2030, says Minister. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said that military spending will double from its current level to hit $100 billion in 2030. Meanwhile, on the exact same day, in the exact same country, schools in England warn of crisis of heartbreaking rise in hungry children. Children are so hungry that they are eating rubbers or hiding in the playground because they can't afford lunch, according to reports from headmasters across England.
A nation that has food banks shouldn't be spending a penny on foreign wars.
If the British government, alongside their dangerous stooges at MI5, really think they are going to trick the British youth into sacrificing their lives in yet another pointless war, then they can think again. As after what the last 20 years plus has shown, you are all completely misaligned and require immediate democratic replacement, with an establishment that has far more national priorities.
But it's not just us.
For any Americans watching, you'll be pleased to hear that your government has spent a staggering $13.6 billion on such weapons, or $42 from every person's bank account.
But remember, you can't have healthcare. That would be too expensive.
Every branch of the US military is struggling to make its 2022 recruitment goals, officials say.
Wow. I wonder why.
Who would fight for a country that treats its countrymen as disposable cannon fodder while giving them nothing in return?
I have a suggestion.
I'd love it if my country spent 100% of taxpayers' money on, wait for it, the taxpayers.
I know. Quite a radical suggestion.
Let's play a game of Would You Rather. Would you rather build a new hospital at home or blow up a hospital abroad? Would you rather have free school meals for children at home or make thousands of children abroad orphans instead? Would you rather build high-quality affordable housing at home or blow up housing abroad instead?
Just remember, when a politician spends money funding overseas wars, it's not their money they're spending, it's your money they're spending.
Fortunately, however, there's a big divide bubbling in the Western world between two opposing foreign policies: interventionism and isolationism. Interventionism being exactly what we've just seen, intervening in the affairs of other, usually weaker nations, mostly as part of an alliance in order to make them succumb to our demands. Isolationism, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, believing that our military should only exist for self-defense purposes and that unless another nation is bothering us, that we should leave them to their own devices.
I did a poll where I asked you all,
what is your attitude to war? And from that, 29% said that they preferred interventionism, with a whopping 71% that said that they preferred isolationism.
and thank God for that.
Because I agree. The primary modus operandi of every government should be to maximise the quality of life of all its citizens, not trying to dictate how the rest of the world should run theirs. Oh no! A developing country has a dictatorship.
Okay.
Oh no! 2 countries on the other side of the world are fighting.
Not our problem.
Critics would of course say that it's easy for one to demand isolationism when I live on an island that can defend itself via a nuclear deterrent. And indeed, I imagine had I been from a more vulnerable state, perhaps my tune may be different. But nevertheless, the facts don't change. All nations should put their own citizens first, while trying to be as self-sustainable as possible. And what goes on abroad, so long as it doesn't affect us directly, shouldn't be any of our concern.
I find that there tends to be a huge wealth divide between those who believe in interventionism and isolationism.
Whereas the Western wealthy are prone to slumbering along unbothered by the increasing inadequacy of their nation's public services, it's the Western poor who are slowly starting to get frustrated with such never-ending war spending, and rightfully so. Day by day, the Western elite complain about the rise of populism in politics, yet the only people who tend to talk about fixing the mess that neoliberalism has created at home, rather than meddling about abroad, are populists. And the facts are that until the Western world drops neoliberalism and starts to reverse the years of damage that it has done to our countries, then populism is only going to continue to surge, particularly among the poor. Fortunately, the attitude for interventionism seems to be at a gargantuan low, and in tandem, trust in neoliberal governments and their media arms has never been lower. Hence, why our establishment has become so authoritarian as of late, as they know that their reign of terror and the perverted ideology of neoliberalism, which meddles with the world and sacrifices those under it, is finally starting to be questioned, and with it, their authority will come crashing down. War has been a constant throughout man's history. People would fight for their families, land, culture, religion, things that are close to them and don't want to lose. Yet today, in the modern West, it's worth asking the question, what exactly it is that our soldiers are fighting for? Because it certainly isn't any of those things. It amazes me how people can be brainwashed into going overseas, to countries they probably couldn't even point to on a map, to end the lives of people they don't know, nor even really know why they're even fighting. Yet at the same time can't comprehend, never mind challenge, the very real threats that face them at home. As the real number one threat is who it was who dared send you to war in the first place: neoliberals. When you go to war today, you're not fighting for freedom and democracy, or whatever other nonsensical propagandistic myths you've been told. You're fighting for the very same establishment that spits in your face at every opportunity at home. The same establishment that allows decadence to thrive. The same establishment that allows corporations to rule over you. The same establishment that allows your children to starve. Neoliberalism. That's what you're fighting for. True patriots don't just go along with whatever their governments tell them. They ask questions and demand answers. And the problem we've faced in the Western world over the last few decades is that we've allowed ourselves to be paralysed by fear, laziness, or God forbid, cowardice. But this isn't the 2000s anymore, and a new era is forming. An era of tense suspicion, whereby rich man's wars will become naught more than a pastime. It's the duty of every individual to demand their governments to work for them, and not the other way around. As rest assured, any government that would send their men to fight and die in such wars is no true government at all. It's time for Western governments to stop trying, and failing, to fix the world, but instead fix the mess that they've turned their countries into. We are not the world police, and we never will be. Enough is enough. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that, and I want to know, are you an interventionist or an isolationist? Again, if you're in the West, such as the United States or Western Europe, Australia, whatever, I imagine everyone who's not ridiculously wealthy or a pseudo-intellectual will probably be an isolationist. But I imagine if you're in Eastern Europe, you'll be overwhelmingly an interventionist for obvious reasons, and I wouldn't really hold that against you, honestly. But all I can say is, being in Western Europe, specifically the UK, seeing the state of this decrepit, dying country giving away money like it's charity is frankly sickening, and I'd like for it to stop, thank you very much. You know who I would like people to give money to? Me! Behold the wall of famers, the only people in the world who actually matter. What do you mean there's an economic crisis? Look folks, think of it like charity, okay? You know when you want to give money to save an endangered animal from going extinct or something like that? Well, I'm an endangered animal. Someone on YouTube who has dignity. You know, that's an endangered animal. I'm joking, you don't need to. But you should, stop being greedy. Alright folks, hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.